We're going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 today. And I love getting into the Word of God. If you want to follow along, you can use a Bible that you brought, or if you want, you can use one of the pew Bibles in front of you, phone app. All of that stuff is fantastic and great. I'm going to have text on screen so you can follow along there as well. But if you will, try to find 2 Chronicles 36 if you want to. Oh, we can go back for a second. We won't quite dive in quite yet. I got a story. A couple years ago, my buddies were sort of into the plasma donation scene, right? I don't know if anybody do that out there? Anybody? All right, a couple people. So great cause, very needed, and really blesses people. My friends were in it, I think, for the $25 that you get for donating, and that's actually what attracted me to it as well. I was like, $25 is $25. I can do this. So I got hooked up to the chair, and I'm all attached to the machine. Apologize if this is making anybody squeamish. I'm going to go ahead anyway, but I'm all hooked up, and it's going along, a little uncomfortable, not too bad, until the nurse comes over. And she's got this disapproving face on. And she's looking at it, and she's like, I don't know. I was like, what's going on? What's wrong? And she's like, well, I've been there for about a half hour. And she's like, you haven't given very much. You have a really bad flow. It's going too slow. It's going to take forever at this rate. It's like, oh, no. And I was like, well, what are we going to do? She's like, well, we'll just try the other arm. And that's when it hit. That's when that feeling, you know what I'm talking about, right? The lightheadedness and everything. And needless to say, I didn't actually get to donate. They took me off, and we sat down for sort of a debrief and a after physical thing. And here's why I'm bringing up the story. I started asking questions about, what could I do better, and how could I, next time, how it would look. And I got this real curt, stern, well, if this happens again next time, you're banned for life. I was like, what? And I've never been back. Not because it was uncomfortable, which was true, and not because I don't like $25, I'd take $25, and not because I don't believe in the cause. Because it's too stressful to be in that zero-tolerance space where if I fail again, I get judged as unfit to give. And I don't want to be in that area at all. And I wonder, in fact, more than wonder, I'd be willing to take a bet on it, that some of us think that that's the way that God is expecting us to relate to him. That he's the one who is holding us to a zero-tolerance standard. You screw up one more time, you're done. If you don't have your morning devotion in the right way and get the right amount out of it, we're over, we're through, we're done. And that zero-tolerance relationship with God, and man, it doesn't provoke intimacy. It doesn't invite relationship. It's a hard place to live. And if that is you, and you're here on a Sunday morning, I want to say thank you for not giving up and for pushing through. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes church doesn't always encourage you very much in knowing that God is not relating with you that way. And even if all those experiences have been there, but you're still wrestling with this, I think that it's fair for us to acknowledge that when we look at the biblical story, sometimes there's sound bites that can reaffirm this idea that God has a zero-tolerance relationship with us. Like, look at the opening story of the Bible. God creates this beautiful world. It's amazing. It's awesome. It's good. And then this serpent comes in and whispers into the voice, or whispers, did God really say? Starts causing questioning. It seems strange that God could demand anything of us. Aren't we free, autonomous people? Start questioning that, and then he follows it up with, oh, you'll not surely die. God's not going to judge you. God's not going to hold you accountable, but then what happens? She takes the fruit, she eats, the guilt sets in, and the judgment falls. God steps into the story as what? The person who immediately reacts to one sin, kicking them out of the garden, away from his presence, and eventually they die. So, zero tolerance, is this God and you? I think it's a fair question. And I'm not convinced that when you read the whole story of the Bible, that that's true. I'm really thankful that you get to see this story play out generation after generation. Did you guys just lose me? Oh, I'm back. Over and over again, for hundreds of years, God relates with a people, and we get to see this really robust way of how he handles sin, his love for people, and his justice, all of it wrapped together. And 2 Chronicles 36 brings us to a place where we get to look at those things as we look at the moment when God's people finally do meet God's judgment. Pray with me one more time, and let's invite the Spirit to teach us as we get in the Word. Spirit, we just want to call out right now that these are your words, and we need you to speak to our hearts. So will you please take this time and take this moment and use it to speak to us. We have listening ears. We are ready to hear what you have to say. I ask that you would guard my mouth and my tongue, that you would guard our time, that you would guard this. Protect us from our enemies' strategies this morning. May we hear you clearly. May we follow you. We ask this in Jesus' name. All right, now we can go to 2 Chronicles 36, and we're going to just start things off here in verse 10. In the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim to Babylon. Many treasures from the temple of the Lord were also taken to Babylon at that time. And Nebuchadnezzar installed Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah as the next king in Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. But Zedekiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and he refused to humble himself when the prophet Jeremiah spoke to him directly from the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. Even though he had taken an oath of loyalty in God's name, Zedekiah was a hard and a stubborn man, refusing to turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. So as we look at this moment, 2 Chronicles 36, if you have a Bible open, you can flip over and you'll realize that this is the end of the book. There's nothing that comes after this chapter. As a tidbit, random factoid, this is actually the last book in the Bible for the Hebrew scriptures. So like the Hebrews, this would be the ending point to their Bible. So the story we're looking at is very much a conclusion type story. All right? So that's helpful, some context. And in digging into context just a little bit more than that, I'd like us to, I lost my spot. I'd like us to think about the characters we're looking at. And the first one is this guy. Oh, that's why. Sorry. It's the pink guy in my fingers. Here we go. I want to look at this guy Nebuchadnezzar. Now, who is he? Well, around the transition from the 7th century to the 6th century BC, the superpowers of the Middle East were kind of up for grabs. There's a transition taking place. Egypt has been the superpower in the past. Assyria presently has been a big deal. Egypt's trying to reassert itself, but all of that's paling in comparison to the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, as they are on the rise and on the move. And at the front of their armies is this general, a prince named Nebuchadnezzar. He's ruthless. And victory after victory is asserting the dominance of the Babylonian Empire. And pretty soon, he actually becomes the king of the empire, or the emperor of the empire, right? Not the umpire, the empire. And Nebuchadnezzar, for a moment, stutters. The kingdom gets shaky for just a half second. And I think that that's where our story fits historically. That shakiness inspires something in Zedekiah that probably shouldn't have been there. Because for only a moment it stutters. And underneath Nebuchadnezzar's leadership, he leads the Babylonian Empire to its absolute peak of power and dominance. And they become the undisputed superpower of the area. And so what do we see in our story? We see King Nebuchadnezzar coming into this little country, Israel or Judah. I'm not going to get into the history of that. Judah and Israel, I might interchange them. Comes to the country and he says, no, you're not going to be king anymore. I choose you. It's ominous. It's a huge power move. And it brings us to our second character, Zedekiah, the guy that he appoints to the throne. Now, Zedekiah was not born as Zedekiah. He was born as a guy named Mattaniah. And he was known as Mattaniah for 21 years. He was one of the sons of the king, until this moment when a whole different king comes in and says, I'm choosing you to be the new king of God's people. And I'm going to rename you and give you a new identity. It's a power move, and it's huge. And this 21-year-old becomes Zedekiah. And we're told a little bit about him. He's quite the character. A hard and a stubborn man. Wraps up the whole kind of reign of him by saying he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So not a great look. He features in one other Bible book a story or the prophecy of the man Jeremiah, who also happens to kind of pop into our story here. He's the spokesperson of God for the day. And Jeremiah doesn't have a good look of him either. This guy is not a hero. He's rebellious, he's prideful, arrogant, stubborn. And even though he's the king of God's people, he doesn't care much for God's ways. On top of that, he was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, and yet we meet him rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar as well. What a guy. And as the king goes, so goes the people. Verse 14, likewise, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful. They followed all the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, desecrating the temple of the Lord. It had been consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them, for he had compassion on his people and his temple. But the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. Now, certainly there's a leadership principle at play here. The leader sets the example for the people who follow him. He sets the temperature, or she sets the temperature. That person, what they do, the way they behave, the way they see, the way they talk, the way they think, the way they live out their faith when we're talking about a theological space, is going to trickle itself down into the people. And I wonder, what are the different places that you're responsible for leading? Maybe there's a family space where you're a leader. Maybe it's a friend group. Maybe it's a workplace. In each of these different spaces, there's a very simple and straightforward leadership principle here. You are on display. Your actions don't impact just you, but others as well. So consider what tone you're going to set. But that's really not the whole point here. That is the practical reality of the text. But the story we're looking at right here is in chapter 36 of 2 Chronicles. And if you notice, there's no chapter 37. This is the ending of the story. And the chronicler, the historian, he's sort of calling back to the story of Israel and their relationship with God. And he even says as much here as God gave them warnings and the prophets, and there's this whole history that they have that's been fulfilled or epitomized in the life of Zedekiah and the people of Israel who follow him. Their failures, their rebellion is a sort of final moment, a tipping point for what has been going on in Israel's relationship with God all along. And we're supposed to see this. We're supposed to see that this is the nature of Israel and their God. God had chosen them to be his people, but instead they had loved other idols, loved other gods. They had worshiped them instead. God had said, if you're going to dwell with me, you are to love your neighbor. Well, they didn't love their neighbor. They did the same thing that every other nation does, which is people who have power use that power to oppress others. Israel did that. The prophets call them out for it. We looked at that last week. If you want to check it out, you can go online and see that. People have wealth, use the wealth to take wealth from other people who have less. And God says, this is not the way you love your neighbor. This is not the way to live as my people. God has bonded himself to Israel. And he said, this is my way. This is what it looks like to be my people. This is what it looks like for me to be in your presence. And that is what sets Israel apart from every other nation. It would be kind of prejudiced of us to think that, hey, Israel is going to somehow miraculously or strangely be better than everybody else. No, they're just another people group, just like every other people group. The thing that makes them different, the reason that we're following Israel's story and not, say, the story of Egypt, is the fact that God has chosen to be present with them. They have a temple that belongs to the one true God, and it's in Jerusalem, and he meets with them there. He hears their prayers there. So when Israel acts, it isn't just rebellion, it's also a statement on the character of who their God is. When Israel says, hey, we're going to worship Yahweh, that's fine and good, but we are also going to worship this other God over here. They declare to the nations that worshiping Yahweh is not enough. He's not big enough to satisfy them. He's not big enough to protect them. He's not strong enough. And all the nations learn a little bit about who God is. When Israel is oppressive in its government, everybody looks on and says, well, these are Yahweh's laws, and so Yahweh must be an oppressive God, domineering and cruel. They have been bound to the name of God, and their actions take him with them. And they're on display. And that would be fine. That would be beautiful and profound if they had kings like David, who loved God, who treasured his laws and took God's laws and actually put them on display and followed them, who made the centerpiece of his legacy passing on God's presence to the next generation and saying, you build the temple because God is greater than all gods on earth. Well, that says lots of great stuff about who God is, right? Lots of true stuff about who God is. The problem is we don't have King David. We've got Zedekiah. And Zedekiah says, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, I'll be loyal to you. Let me invoke the name of my God, Yahweh. By Yahweh's name and character, I will be loyal to you. And then the first chance he gets, he betrays Nebuchadnezzar. What's that say of Yahweh? What's that say of the God of Israel? That's why this is a big deal. Okay? And it leads us to this moment in the text, verse 16, that I think is one of the more chilling moments in the Old Testament and the Bible. 2 Chronicles 36:16. The people scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. Nothing. The God who created the world out of nothing inspires the historian, the chronicler, to write down, this is what happened. Nothing could be done with this people's rebellion. That's heavy. Zero tolerance. That's the thing on the floor today, right? We're talking about, is God have this zero tolerance relationship with you and I? Well, the whole tone of this text is heading towards judgment, isn't it? And it feels like we're seeing God saying, enough is enough. I am not going to tolerate this. You are not going to be allowed to trash my name in this way. And we're going to see what happens next with God. But before we go into that, don't we need to notice that this comes after 500 years of patience? And it's not as though that was empty time. But we'll generously say something like 50 years is a generation. So for 10 generations, something like that. I'm not trying to make a claim about that one way or another. For 10 generations, for 500 years, God has wooed his people through his prophets, calling them back. God has loved his people by giving them a place in his land and providing for them season after season. God has extended forgiveness every time his people came back to him. God has raised up good kings who led them in repentance and led them in revival and who ended oppression. God has been faithful for 500 years, and he's been patient for 500 years. God didn't jump into this. But we have come to the point where the judgment falls. And what does it look like? In verse 17. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used in the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. Then his army burned the temple of God, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, and completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. Now, I don't need to tell you that this is intense. I don't need to tell you that this is severe, that this is a grave, dark moment. It speaks for itself. God's judgment, let alone Nebuchadnezzar's judgment, for he was rebelled against too, right? Like, it's intense. But God uses Nebuchadnezzar in order to bring this judgment on his people. And it comes in three forms. The first, according to the text, is death. So God brings Nebuchadnezzar, and his military overcomes Israel's military, Zedekiah's military. And so the young men die. But it's not just the young men, it's all the wives as well, all the young women. And it's not just them, it's also their parents, the old. And it's not just them, it's the people in the hospitals, the infirm. They all die at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And then the second form of the judgment is exile. You see this towards the end of the passage we just read. The people who are allowed to survive are taken off into captivity, into Babylon, to become servants of the royal family. And this is where the story of Israel continues. And next week we're going to be continuing and picking that up, and we're moving forward with this group of people to see what life is like as exiles. But today what I want to draw attention to is that both death and exile are different forms of separation, right? Death, at the risk of being a little bit obvious, is separation from life, right? Exile is separation from home, from land. I think we could also say exile is separation from God's promises, right? Because the promises of God are to live in this land, to be his people here, to be brought back into the garden. But they've been separated from that. They've been kicked away. And I bring this up because there's a third part to the judgment, and it's the temple's destruction. First couple times I read through this, I was kind of like, well, I want to skip to the parts that are more poignant and meaningful. The loss of life and human dignity, as slaves, that stuff preaches, that stuff gets to my heart. Apparently to the sound systems as well. But the temple's destruction, I don't even know what half of these articles are that are being taken away. And sir, we could go and look them up, but does that evoke much in me? And so I want to help us wrestle with this. Imagine the church burns down. Okay? Building's gone. What would happen the next week? Certainly there's plans to rebuild, there's plans to do that, but people start having conversations about, well, what are we going to do in the meantime? Where are we going to meet in the meantime? And so maybe we go and visit a neighboring church, and we partner with them next week. But then we start talking about rental situations. Where are we going to rent on a regular basis from a school or from a park or something like that so that we can continue to meet and continue to celebrate like this on a Sunday? We would continue on more or less as normal in a different location. That cannot happen for Israel. The temple's destruction means the end of their ability to worship God. It means the end of their cultural identity. It means the end of their ability to go somewhere where God says, I'm present here to listen to your prayers, to receive your sacrifices, to listen to your worship, to engage with you. Israel is God's people, But Nebuchadnezzar came into God's house, and he wasn't there. Separation from life, separation from land, and separation from God. That's why the chronicler lists this as the center of the judgment. This is it. This is the end. Israel is dead and gone, destroyed, dispersed across the earth to go back to the nations they came from. How heavy. Now, I understand that the temple's a symbol. The chronicler gets that. And so it's a little different than the people actually being all gone. But symbols carry the weight of reality. If I burn a flag on stage, I'm saying something true and real, right? For the temple to be burned, destroyed, and taken down is saying something real about their relationship with God. We're talking about zero tolerance and judgment and punishment and all that stuff today. We get this poignant, silent statement, if you will. Verse 21, the message of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. Zero tolerance for sin looks like justice being fulfilled. And it was. For the first time, the land as a witness was able to look and see the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. For the years of God's warnings, it had finally all come true. And Israel had been sent away from God's very presence for the sins that they had committed. God's justice, God's promise, this is all proved out. And no sin was forgotten or left out in this judgment. The thing is, though, that this is the only way that this phrase is true about our relationship with God. He does have zero tolerance when it comes to sin. But he does not, the only word I can think of is adjudicate, and I apologize if that's a bad word to use in this sense. He doesn't adjudicate his justice in a zero tolerance sort of way. Okay, take a look at the text again, okay? We'll go right back into it. So the message of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate, until the 70 years were fulfilled. What is that telling us? That the judgment of death, which is final, complete, and total, and deserved, is not the end of Israel's story. It's only a semicolon till we begin the next part. God's justice is deserved by Israel, but what they get instead is a discipline that leads to something else. The zero tolerance way of relating with God misses the reality that, one, God's patience predates all of this by 500 years. God's warnings predate all of this in the invitation for you to come back and have a relationship. My wife would love if my patience ran for 500 years, okay? Right? My kids would love that too. God is incredibly mature in the way that he relates with the people and the relationship he has. It's filled with mercy and patience and grace and forgiveness and justice. And even in the justice, it leads us to something else, something that comes after the justice comes. And what is that? Let's take a look. Verse 22. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given to Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation in writing and to send it throughout his kingdom. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any of you who are his people may go, therefore, for this task, and may the Lord, your God, be with you. The end of Chronicles, this whole history of God's people, is not Israel's death. It's their resurrection. 70 years go by, and God brings his people back to life. You see that? What was the judgment? Separation from life, separation from the land and God's promises, and separation from God himself. And at the end of it, what has God done? He's raised up a king, a guy named Cyrus, who has been appointed and chosen for the task. He's a Messiah. That's what that means. Appointed, God's appointed one. His Messiah, his Christ, is a guy named Cyrus in this instance. So he's been chosen for this task. What? To bring the people who are still alive, even in exile. He's to bring those people who are still alive, they're not dead, back to their homeland, back into the covenant, back into the promises of God, so that they can rebuild a temple, so that God can be with them. It's the resurrection story. Israel's story is a story of people who do not deserve God's love and grace, but God made a promise to them. And when they rebelled and pushed back against it over and over and over again, the justice that it demanded was their death. But God raised up a king who brought them back into his presence. Now, Cyrus does that by issuing a command. The bigger story, the bigger reality, is that Jesus does that by stepping into the place of his people and letting the punishment fall on him so that the punishment doesn't fall on us. Then he overwhelms that punishment, and the mercy of Jesus satisfies the justice demands of God's character. And you and me, when we follow Jesus, walk out of the grave along with him. Resurrection. And so we're not afraid of death as followers of Jesus. This is the story of Israel. For the Hebrews, their scriptures end here, on this note, that we failed God and died. But he brought us back to life and has given us a new chance. And the chronicler calls out to the people of Israel and says, what are you going to do? He wants them to love the God who shows mercy. Love the God who has not engaged with them with a zero-tolerance, one-and-done way of relationship, but instead has extended forgiveness, second chance, and new life. Where else can they go but this merciful God? And Jesus extends the chronicler's cry to you and me. And he says, where else can you go to find this sort of love and life from God? It's not about a zero-tolerance way of relating to me. It's about receiving new life and then following me with that new life. To go back to the story at the beginning, at the plasma donation, I haven't gone back there, and I know it's kind of a silly example, but I've actually been in real relationships as well where that dynamic was at play, where I felt like I was walking on eggshells, and at any moment I might break faith and get in huge trouble with the other person, and it's terrible, right? Like, nobody wants to live that way. And whenever I have thought that that's the way that God expects me to relate to him, he's shown me otherwise. He's brought me to different parts of Scripture. He's spoken to me through the forgiveness of other people following Jesus. But he's reaffirmed over and over and over again that his love for me is enough. And my sins I get to bring to him, and he can handle it. And he doesn't send me aside, but he gives them to Jesus, and Jesus nails those sins to the cross as they deserve, as I deserve, and smiles at me and says, now come follow me. I know exactly what all those things are. Come follow me. And that's the invitation in front of us. Every sin, every time gets judged, but not every sinner, because Jesus. He takes the sins of those who follow him. And I want that for all of us. Will you pray with me?